Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Jamison Braun, the Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Salesforce. Jamison, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jory. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. There's so much to dive into here, but I think a good place to start is recognizing that change is fast and furious for a lot of agencies right now. And agencies have to balance this modernization push with a bunch of other growing challenges. What are the key factors that are driving this shift?
I think there's a lot of them, right? And I think the one constants that we've always had is obviously been change. But I think the very first one, right, is this shrinking and speed to which we demand more from our governments. And we talk about demanding more from our governments. It's blending this relationship that we have in our personal lives, which we are expecting from the constituency that gives to us all the time. So I think that's the very first one. It's the shrinking of not wanting to wait. The other thing I think that is the speed of technical adoption. So how much faster we're delivering a capability and what that means, especially in the federal workforce or the government workforces. And then how do we deliver that expectation back to our citizens? And then I think there's two other coupling factors for us. One is for the first time in, I think, ever, we have six generations present in the workforce, everywhere from the brand new college graduate to the people that still served or post service of the Vietnam era. So we've got these six generations that we're dealing with, all that have different technical adoption rates. And then I think the last piece is that we also have this critical shortage of labor of people that are wanting to serve in the government sector. So all of those things I think contribute to the melting pot that we have right now.
Yeah, that's an important point there, Jameson. And another thing in this puzzle here, another piece of it is that the public sector workforce is facing a skilled labor shortage. There's always this demand to bring more folks in, and technology is advancing at an unprecedented pace here with AI and all the emerging tech. How can AI tools, how can they help bridge this gap that we've been seeing?
I think the first thing is really access to information. I mean, we just have this confluence of whether it's this week where we get a slew of new executive orders, but every time that there's an administration change or there are political appointments or there's even just a shift in a new organization, there's going to be new regulations, directives, and instructions. And normally those take a long time to trickle down through an individual organization. So I think the first thing that we can really leverage is um, cutting through the complexity associated with that type of doctrine and presenting it in a way that makes sense for the end user. I think that's a classic case study right up front where you can leverage the agentic layer to really deliver effect.
And AI is transforming these government operations, but this adoption isn't always green lights and no hurdles here. Adoption has varied across agencies. The growth of that adoption looks different agency by agency. What are the biggest barriers to AI adoption in government, in public sector today?
That's a loaded question, Jory. Hey, listen, I think we ought to start with what it is versus what it isn't when we talk about artificial intelligence. From our lens, we say that we're currently in the third wave of artificial intelligence. So the very first one is what we would call predictive analytics, looking backwards on a story of what data you were able to access and the story that it told you. The second wave was really this idea of generative AI. So leveraging the data sets that you have to summarize or create an executive summary or a synthesis so that you had a greater access at a speed by which you might make a decision or take the next action. And then the third wave, what we call legitimate artificial intelligence, is taking action on things that don't require human intervention. And you've heard our CEO, Mark Benioff, repeatedly talk about the digital labor revolution. So imagine, especially in government, where we've had predefined start and stop hours, and we work religiously, 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. Employing digital labor to take action on our behalf allows us to actually now work 24/7, round the sun operations for global entities. And I think that's really a game changer, first and foremost. The second thing that I think is really relevant for us is the ability to constantly move forward and reduce what I will call the hierarchy of communication. So in those governmental organizations, everything starts at the very top and then trickles down to the end user, which is the person serving the customer. And AI now allows the customer to be customer zero, to have the information at the speed of relevance. I think that's a value proposition that can't be understated in this environment.
Yeah, I wanted to return to the customer experience piece of things because you mentioned earlier in this conversation that governments are under this growing pressure to deliver a level of experience that they expect from private sector companies. What are some of the most common challenges, most common pain points that agencies face when it comes to delivering those public facing services?
So a real challenge is not even having access to your current data set. I mean, governments are replete with having stovepiped legacy mainframes and infrastructure that doesn't allow them to communicate in a streamlined fashion. So that's the first piece. We have to be able to unlock the data. And that's where agents are super successful, right? They can go in and actually uncover areas where you may not even know that authoritative data resides. So that's the first one. The second one, I do not think, and I think that you'll hear this in the federal government, is an adoption problem. And I say that from the perspective of what we refer to as thin work and thick work. And thick work is all the stuff that we do in the government. It's inputting manual information into databases. It's filling out forms in triplicate. It's processing stuff on a flow. Thin work is stuff that we do in our personal lives. This is why I say I don't think that we have an adoption problem. I've yet to meet a government employee that doesn't have one cell phone or many multiple phones, or who isn't exercising all of their banking operations or their personal listening habits, or communicating with their kids or ordering supply chain distribution like on Amazon, all from the beauty of their phones. And when you look at the digital adoption curve, right, from the old, the telephone that took 75 years to get 100 million users, all the way to TikTok or Chat GPT that did it in a period of 2 days. I do not believe that we have an adoption program yet. I know that we are still writ with that type of narrative.
Continuing down this idea here, you know, how can agencies meet these higher expectations of their customers, continue to deliver things bigger, faster, more relevant to the needs of their customers, without overburdening their workforce, recognizing there's only so many work hours in a week, trying to respond to these growing demands?
Yeah, great question. So, I'll throw you um, a short narrative out there pretty quickly. That's just don't DIY your AI. Um, you know, the commercial sector has been very successful in delivering these thin work or personal experiences, both at speed and at scale. The world's largest companies, right, are fully embracing this type of evolution. So I think the first thing is, buy, don't build these capabilities and leverage your corporate co-investment partners to really help you on this journey. The second piece is I want to look internally at those federal governments, which is reduce the friction. As a 30-year government employee, as a senior executive for a very long time, we used to joke in the Pentagon on things like, man, we're always being asked to do more with less. So here's an opportunity for us as federal employees to do more with less for the first time by leveraging this digital labor and these agents. And the second piece is internally, let's reduce the friction. So the friction comes from being the internal employee and not knowing where to or how to access a plethora of information that are my governing regulations and authorities. In this case, I can reduce the friction by delivering that capability by leveraging agents.
And let's talk more about those agents because that's just one more tool in the toolbox for agencies to deliver on this digital first customer experience. How are those agents enhancing public sector operations?
I think you've got a litany of case studies that can be applied. And while we're still in the infancy and haven't seen a lot of this employed yet in the federal sector, um, I think we can start with something simple, which is anywhere that we have current call centers. So think something like the Center for Medicaid, think the Department of Veterans Affairs, Health and Human Services, the Department of the IRS, Internal Revenue. Any area where we have customers who are currently seeking a resolution from a government agency, I think we could leverage agents to deliver uh, much faster and with a greater degree of fidelity the answer that those people are looking for. So think of not having to wait in line for 37 minutes on the telephone call because we just don't have enough civil servants to be able to provide the service. And in this case, we can quickly get the people the answer that they need so that they get on with their own lives and get back to the productivity of the world's greatest country. So I think that's one. The other thing that I think that you have is this dissolution of all of the complex things that we have in government. So, those changing executive orders, the areas where there's lots of instructions, but they're confusing. Think of national emergency zones, whether it was the hurricane or the California fires, but anywhere where things are super complex and people become displaced. The first question is what is my government or how can my government help? And the same is true for the government employee. It's how can we help? But then it's the interagency collaboration. What are all the entitlements that somebody may be eligible for? And how do we quickly expedite them through that process? This is another area where I think agents can help immediately.
Yeah, I think what you've been describing here, Jameson, is really a matter of scale that for some of these agencies, let's say the IRS, for example, they get a ton of calls that are basic questions like when's the filing deadline or, where's my tax refund? When can I expect to receive that? And by having digital agents help with that workload, it allows the IRS workforce to triage some of the more complex questions, leave those to the IRS experts who can dive into those thornier questions.
Right. And, I think we tried this, Jory, years ago, right? There was an inverted pyramid of like self-service that we tried to place into contact centers and call centers. And it just never reached the label of fruition because in our mindset at the time, it was let's create knowledge articles to teach people how to fish. But those knowledge articles became more and more cumbersome and they became overlaid on these legacy, IT frameworks that every agency was running. I think agents now will finally bring that to fruition to allow us to open up that aperture and live up to the promise that we delivered about 20 years ago.
Right. Well, you mentioned earlier in this conversation about this digital labor revolution. Let's maybe expound on that a little bit more and how this is a new frontier for the business of government. Uh, how is that shift playing out, and how can folks like Salesforce help agencies successfully navigate that shift?
The first thing I think is important to understand is that you have to be grounded in this idea of trust. So, and in the Salesforce portfolio, one of the things that we harness ourselves on is not only is trust as our single most important value, but we couple it with things like transparency and accountability. So, and we have our own RAG layer as we run through our agentic layer that removes things like toxicity and hallucinations, and is constantly learning and keeping humans in the loop to refine this layer of trust. Because it's not enough for you to be able to ask a query or generate a prompt and get an answer. We need to constantly validate and make even reduce the error variance more and more every single time that similar type of inquiry or prompt is generated. So I think that becomes super important for us. The other area that I think is important is that we continue to deliver on the business outcome. So whatever it is that the government agency is trying to use, I'll use another example, which I think is a classic use case, which is the hiring authorities and classification. So in the government, sometimes we have 50-page resumes and a 3-page job classification to ensure that we've dotted every I and crossed every T. But the reality is that may be antiquated based on an old Manning document that was several years old that hasn't been refined. But the scope and responsibility of the job that I need to hire for today is very dynamic. So this is another area where agents can link competencies of the person applying for the job with the actual dynamics of the job and speed up that hiring process.
Jameson, like so many other things in government, it sounds like this really comes down to people, process, technology. It's always those three things working in harmony. We've been talking a lot about the technology and we've been talking about the other things too, but as far as how they can all integrate here, what's your advice to agencies looking to integrate these AI tools and these digital labor solutions into their operations? What's your advice to them?
So I love the PPT construct. I'd offer there's one more piece to it, which is organizational structure. So people, process, technology, and organizational structure, and those four legs of that stool must work synchronously to be able to deliver the effect you're working with. I think the first piece is buy white space, right? So another talk track is right. We talked about reducing the friction, do more with less, but buy white space. President Kennedy many years ago said. We should never have government doing something that can be done better by somebody else, right? That's just not a good investment of our own time. And matter of fact, it buys down employee satisfaction and customer engagement simultaneously. So if we can buy white space by creating a better value proposition and reducing the monotony for our government workers, that allows us to actually be more competitive on the global landscape. We can reprioritize the human capital and the intellectual capital that we have for our very dedicated workforce into this new evolution. Like I said, we're on the third step, right? Which is, this artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence. But there's a couple steps beyond that. And the better that we can prepare our civil servants and prevent them from being swivel servants by leveraging AI, the more prosperous I think that we will be as a country.
Jameson, early in this conversation, you were talking about the adoption curve within the federal workforce. And you also mentioned how we have these six generations in the workforce now. And it occurs to me that this is an awful lot of change management, depending on which generation you belong to here. Can you expand a little bit more on what this means for agencies to communicate this change to everyone from boomers to Gen Z and everyone in between? How do they communicate the value proposition that all of this change brings to the federal workforce?
Yeah, I mean, to use another anecdote, right? I'd say it's like moving from inline, standing in line, regardless of generation, to constant validation online. So moving from inline to online. The change management obviously is very complex, right? I mean, there are areas of demographics and generations that like maintaining status quo, but nobody likes to wait. Like we are a country that likes to deliver quality and capability as soon as possible, and we like to realize that value. So I think from a change management perspective, everybody wants to deliver it. I think if you look at the top tier of the curve, right, from the silent generation, they absolutely want to make sure that they're delivering the right value at the right value or at the right time to their constituency. And then if you look at the brand new people entering the workforce, they want everything right now, but they're willing to accept a greater degree of risk. I think the sweet spot in there is accepting a level of trust that benefits all parties across the continuum.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea of trust, obviously a huge part of all of this. What can agencies do to kind of engender this sense of trust as all this change is going on, both within the workforce and with the customers who are on the receiving end, are benefiting from these government services? How can you ensure that trust is being established on both of those parties?
The first thing I think you have to do is ground trust in truth. So, and I think especially in government sectors, that means grounding truth in data. So, and sadly, right, we have data that exists in multiple platforms. So the first thing that we have to do is unlock existing data so that we do have that baseline of what we consider truth to be. And then the next piece is making sure that that data becomes less and less error prone and less subject to that toxicity and hallucination and error variance, and trying to get to just the refined data element. What is it that I'm looking for, and how does it directly apply to the constituent? So I think that's the most important thing. But when we talk about data, I think there's also an opportunity here for governments to lead by combining both structured and unstructured data to be able to connect.
Well, we've been diving into a lot of what's been going on and what will be going on in the future here. But some agencies are just getting started with all of this. For those agencies that are in that camp, what would you recommend as far as first steps? Where can they get started, and how can they get their feet wet when it comes to all things AI?
First thing is create white space in your calendar to become educated. So, there are so many great companies doing so many great things right now to advance artificial intelligence. Some are actually delivering on the promise, other are pontificating on this idea of it. But I would say don't be afraid to accept a level of operational risk. Two would be, don't DIY your AI. So some people, especially the federal government, is not an artificial intelligence agency. It's there to serve its constituency, and artificial intelligence is an enabler to do that at the speed of relevance or the speed of mission. So I would say don't DIY your AI. Don't be afraid to limp in. Don't be afraid to accept some operational risk, and absolutely prioritize both unlocking your data, leading with an objective data set every single day for your senior leaders. So, and then moving forward at the pace that makes sense for the delivery of your constituents. So it doesn't make sense for you to go all in and lose your citizenry behind you. But at the same time, we realize that our constituency does expect more from government, and we need to start delivering while reducing the friction for our employees and the people that we serve.
We've covered a ton of ground here, Jameson. There's so much that agencies need to keep in mind here. Is there anything that we didn't get to that agencies should know about when it comes to getting started with AI, or is there anything you'd like to just underscore as a key takeaway here?
I think the most important thing is really to embrace this idea of digital labor. And I'll say that, especially government workers, we get so afraid when we hear things like digital, right? Because we think that uh, it's an encroachment upon our livelihood. I can assure you from somebody that spent 4 decades in the federal government, that what we're looking at here is a revolution that will supplement and augment the absolutely dedicated workers that we have today. But imagine being able to do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and reducing the backlogs that create friction in your organizations right now. So whether it's a request for the generation of medical forms, or it's somebody's records where you've got massive backlogs, imagine going to bed every night and having people take care of those backlogs so that when you show up the next day, so you are better positioned to deal with customers for the even more complex cases where your knowledge and competency and experience of years in government can really deliver the greatest effect where it's needed the most. So this idea of digital labor, I would really get excited about. I would lean into, because I really think it's going to be a game changer. And for somebody that spent all my time in government to now who is in, the tech force, I can tell you I have never been more excited than I am right now of being able, even for myself, to buy more white space in both my personal and my professional life, thanks to the agentic layer.
And finally, Jameson, where can agencies learn more about Salesforce's digital agents and how all of this fits into each agency's individual modernization journey?
I think first and foremost, right, there should be a QR code, but if there's not, check out Salesforce for Government or Agent Force. Those are great ways you can come. You can schedule a workshop. We're happy to do discovery with you, show you some of the use cases that we've done with other federal organizations across the globe, and then really lean into this idea of that revolution for you and your constituents.
All right. Thanks again to today's guest, Jamison Braun, the Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Salesforce. I'm Jory Heckman, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now, let me send you back to the studio for more on the AI and data exchange.